Hey Wargamers, Mike here from the Epic Hobby, and today I'm back with part 2 of the Wolverine painting tutorial. In part 1 I got all the base coats and some washes down to get the basic detailing done, and this one is going to be all about getting the real detail work finished. I'm going to begin by getting a bunch of colors ready on my wet palette, starting with Uriel Yellow and Techless Blue. These will obviously be used to highlight the yellow and blue parts of Wolverine's spandex suit. I'm also going to use a little bit of P3 Moro White, which I'll be mixing into other colors just to lighten them up. Additionally, I'll be using some Wild Rider Red to highlight his belt, which is the only red detail on the miniature. I'll also be using a little bit of Mephiston Red just to brighten the belt back up before I highlight it. Aside from those colors, I'll also be using all the base coat colors that are already on my wet palette. In case you missed episode 1, I'll go ahead and rhyme those off as I encounter them. So first up, I grab the Uriel Yellow, so this is the yellow color I'm going to be highlighting with, and I start actually highlighting the yellow aspects, and what I find is it's a little bit too thin and it's a little bit too far of a jump from the color that's there right now. So what's underneath that is Averland Sunset with a sepia wash, and the sepia wash really brought the Averland Sunset down more than I expected, so I'm actually going to pick up some Averland Sunset, which is already on my palette, and use that just to brighten up the areas first before I start doing some real highlights. So here I'm using the Averland Sunset and just working my way around Wolverine, and just using it to highlight up the sort of larger, flatter areas of his musculature that have been painted yellow already, just so they're a little bit brighter than the washed base coat ended up being. This process takes a few minutes, but it's definitely not as long as the original base coat took. You can see here as I start to apply the Averland Sunset to the individual muscle groups that they really start to stand out from the base coat, so it was definitely worth doing this additional step. Alright, now all the areas that were base coated with Averland Sunset have been brightened back up again. I'm going to start applying the Uriel Yellow in roughly the same pattern, just more refined, kind of a little bit of a sharper detail, so that I get a brighter yellow spot where I've brightened up each of the other areas already. You'll notice I'm saying the word bright a lot. I really want to capture that, you know, late 90s Saturday morning cartoon feel that Wolverine's yellow and blue suit really brings out. And so I want the yellow and blue to really stand out and have very bright highlights. Because if you remember the old cartoons, they were basically shaded almost entirely with black, and I didn't want to go that far, but I really wanted to bring it all the way up to that almost white, really bright, super highlight, and just make the colors really, really stand out. Especially on the table, I want this miniature to be very visible. So you can see when I'm using the urea yellow, I'm really focusing on basically the top half of each muscle group. Now that I'm done, or mostly done with the yellow areas, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process on the blue areas. So I'm going back to my base coat color, which was MacLeod blue. Now, the blue areas didn't get toned down as much by the wash as the Averland Sunset did by the sepia wash. So this step isn't quite as important, so I'm really just focusing on some details that I want to be a little bit brighter, such as the outside of the boots, the gloves, and his shoulders. Because there wasn't as much of a shading effect from the wash against the blue, I also don't really have to worry about pulling the muscle groups out quite so much. This is a much faster step. Now I'm moving over to the Techless blue and doing some general edge highlights and brightening up of the blue areas. This is basically going to be the same process I used with the urea yellow, except that the blue areas tend to be a little bit flatter. They don't have the same kind of ripply muscle definition that the yellow does, so there's a lot less work to do. With Wolverine's shoulder pads, I want to emulate a little bit of a sheen, give this sort of like a patent leather kind of look. And so I'm going to have one bright stripe sort of going across the top of each shoulder, just to give the impression of some sunlight or local lighting glinting off the shoulders. So with the Techless blue, what I'm aiming for is sharp edges, folds in the fabric, and then specific details like the fingers, which kind of don't stand out on their own very well. And I'm just adding some extra brightness to them to make them stand off from the base of the hand. Now I've mixed a little bit of the Mora white in with the Techless blue to get a lighter shade of blue, and I'm going to repeat some of the edge highlighting, really focusing on very specific points now. As I mentioned before, I want to make the shoulder pads look exceptionally shiny, as I want that patented leather kind of look to them, and so I'm making sure they have very bright, reflective lines happening across them. You can start to see now that the extra highlight on the fingers is really paying off, and they really do stand out at this point. From this angle, hopefully you can see and appreciate what I was trying to describe earlier about the shoulders, where they really do have a sort of local light reflection happening now. To really sell that point though, I am going to take the highlights even a little bit further after this. Now I've gone ahead and added even more Mora white into the mix just for some very final highlights on the blue. You can see the paint on my brush is almost a pure white at this point, just has a little bit of a blue tint to it. You can see as I work my way around the model with this super light blue, I'm being very selective with how I apply it. It's almost always just going on as small dots. And again, from this angle, I think you can really appreciate the effect I was trying to bring out on that shoulder. There's a tiny bit of bare metal showing between the claws, so I'm going to hit them again with the dark blue wash just to try and kind of black that out. This is also going to give the claws a little bit of a cooler appearance towards the glove. Okay, at this point Wolverine's clothing is basically done with, and I can move on to the last few details, which is more or less just his skin. Here I'm picking back up the Vallejo dwarf skin that I previously used on the wet palette, and I'm just going to go ahead and same thing I did with the yellow, I'm going to brighten up the larger areas again because the sepia wash did tone them down quite a bit. However, I am making sure I leave that sepia wash really visible in the deeper crevices between the muscle groups, because it does help give a lot of definition to them. Because there's not a whole lot of exposed skin on Wolverine, this is a much faster step than anything I've done today so far. There's not a lot of skin exposed on Wolverine's face, and because of the scale of this model, this can be quite tricky to get right. Don't be afraid to make a mistake or two and correct it if you need to. All I'm really focused on highlighting on his face is his chin and his upper and lower lip, all of which are basically three little straight lines. Now I'm using straight Moro white, and I'm just going to try and dot each of his eyes. Remember that in the cartoons that I'm taking inspiration from, when he had his cowl on, you didn't see anything but the whites of his eyes. There was no pupil showing. And so I can get away with just painting a white eye, because it is actually true to the reference artwork. I usually find it easier to paint a model's right eye by turning the model upside down, so that's why I'm holding it in this way. Next I'm going to be painting Wolverine's teeth, which is really again just a little straight line across the inside of his mouth. I'm using mostly Moro white here with just the tiniest bit of black added in to make it just faintly gray. It's still almost pure white, but very pure white details can be a little bit too striking. So I just want to tone it down just a touch. Okay, now that I'm confident with Wolverine's facial details, I'm going to go back to highlighting the rest of his skin. To do that, I've just again gone back to the dwarf skin and added a little bit of Moro white into it to make a lighter shade. If you're wondering why I did half the skin highlighting, then took a break to make the secondary color, it's because I wanted to get some of the highlighting done, especially around the facial details, but in case I messed up the facial details, especially painting the teeth, I didn't want to have to redo too much work. So after I got just the dwarf skin done, I painted the eyes and the teeth, and I'm now going around highlighting all the other areas because I'm confident that I don't have to go back and repaint something. On most miniatures, the eyes are actually one of the first things I paint, or at least one of the first things I paint on the face. But with Wolverine, there really weren't any eyes. There's just two little white orbs inside of his cowl, and so there was a lot less nervousness and trepidation, and honestly less skill involved in painting his eyes. When it comes to painting the eyes on Rogue in a future video, I'm going to be a lot more cautious, and I'm not sure how that's going to actually show up on video. I'm going to do one more pass of highlights on the skin, adding even more Moro white into the skin tone. This is basically just going to consist of a few point highlights on his chin and upper lip. I'll also add some point highlights to the muscle groups on his arms just to make them stand out and glisten a little bit more. just to really kind of give the impression that they're really straining. Having finished most of the other highlights, I've decided the yellow areas are a little bit flat by comparison, so I've worked a little bit of Morrow White into the Uriel Yellow, and I'm using that as just an extreme highlight on a little bit of the yellow areas. And now I've gone back to Mephiston Red just to brighten up the belt. Finally, I'm going to use Wild Rider Red just to add a linear highlight to the top of the belt all the way around. And that's it. Aside from basing this model, Wolverine is done. There's something really enjoyable about painting a well-recognized character and pulling it off well. Unlike a random Space Marine or Orc, everyone knows who Wolverine is, and this is a great piece to put on display and kind of hook your friends into talking about your wargaming habits. I hope you enjoyed this longer video format. I know it was split into 2 parts and ran almost an hour in length, but I hope it showed you some of the finer detail work and you really learned something from it. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.